something. And anyway, we got to visit with some friends from our long past. We went all the way to North Carolina where we had been back in the 80s, and got to check on people and visit people I worked with and people that we went to church with, and we just had a really good time. Appreciate so much opportunity to go and not have to worry about what someone else says. Bailed me out, and then we got back, and it was, next thing you know, it was gospel meeting, and it just fell to where, I don't know, it feels like it's been a month and a half or so since I've been up here. Anyway, it's good to be here today. We've been studying in the book of Galatians. If you want to find your way there, find all the way over to the chapter 6, the end of Galatians. We're going to try to wrap it up today. The last part of chapter 6, we begin about verse 11, is where we'll be reading when we get to that point. It's been a good study. In some ways, it's been hard to get the thoughts that Paul is explaining here, to talk about it and understand. He's dealing with a lot in the book about. Well, my mind just went blank. I'm sorry. In verse 11 of chapter 6, we'll take it there and start. Paul takes up the pen and he says, "See with what large letters I have written to you with my own hand." And he's writing at the close of this letter to the Galatians. Normally he just signs off. He says, in 1 Corinthians, he does a salutation with his own hand, but in 2 Corinthians, he just wishes them well. And in Romans, he says, "The grace of the Lord Jesus be with you." Rome, he never had been to Rome, so he didn't really know those people. But Ephesians and Philippians, he just signs off. And in Colossians, he does by my own hand. And he did a note, but he didn't, on any of the other letters, he didn't write as much as he did to Galatians as he closes the letter out. So it is significant, I think, that he writes a short paragraph to the Galatians. And it's a personal note that gives them a sense of his feelings for them. He is a little bit anxious about their situation because these intruders, he refers to them, have come in and tried to change some of the teachings that he had given them to start with. And so he's a little bit apprehensive about it. And he may be afraid that these intruders were taking advantage of their, I wish you'd say, less than stellar intelligence. You remember when we started the book, we talked about the people that were living there in Galatia, that Rome had transplanted some people there, mercenaries who had fought and were soldiers for Rome. And they were not the most intelligent. They made good servants, okay? The people that originally lived there, they made good slaves. And so they weren't really known for their major contributions to literature. I mean, the biggest contribution they had was like Aesop's Fables, came from those people. They're just little short stories that had a little moral, and that was the extent of their thinking ability. Okay, so Paul's a little bit concerned that people would come in from the outside and teach things in that church, in those groups of churches, perhaps, that might have misled or confused the people. He's just previously taught in this chapter about the contrast between the life that's lived in the flesh and the one that's led by the Spirit. And he pointed out that those who live in subjection to the flesh nature, the flesh side of our being, will not inherit the kingdom of God. And we don't always realize that we are in subjection to the flesh nature. When we do our own thing, it feels like freedom, but we are really in bondage. How should we say it? Human life is a little bit strange. We get the notion that we are free, and we are free in a lot of ways. But we either follow God or we follow the evil one. Those are our two choices. And Satan's perfectly willing for you to go your own way and to do your own thing. He lets us call it what we want to. He lets us think of it how we want to, as long as we're not doing God's thing. All right? That's the only thing he cares about, is if we don't do God's thing. And so we get deceived sometimes, I think, when we think we're free doing our own thing, and when actually we are in subjection, or we are subject to our own fleshly nature. And it's only later that we realize that we can't any longer make a decision to go the other way. We've gone so far into the fleshly side, the evil side, that we can't back up. All right. In chapter 5, verse 24, he makes this very convicting statement that I wanted to bring into our discussion here, that those who are Christ's have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. Have you got that in control? Your passions and desires? We all struggle with this. It's a constant battle. And I think that plays into this battle of the flesh and the spirit that he's talking about there in verse 11. Essentially, he's saying that it's not the flesh that we want the good showing in, it's the Spirit, the life of the Spirit, that we want to have the good showing in with its trusting faithfulness that pleases our Father. In verse 12, he says that they try to compel you, let's see, as many as desire to make a good showing in the flesh, these try to compel you to be circumcised, only that they may not suffer persecution for the cross of Christ. The situation in the Roman Empire for the Jews, they had an exemption. Under some of the emperors, at least, they had an exemption from the state cult. You remember every year they would have to go and they'd take a pinch of incense and they would throw it on the altar and they had to say, "Caesar is Lord." Well, the Jews would not do that. Neither would the Christians, as far as that goes. Couldn't do that. But they had actually, the Romans had given them an exemption because they would just stand there in line to be killed before they would say, "Caesar is Lord." And so Rome had let it go. You know, there was times when some of the emperors tried to, and one I think did, try to put images in the temple in Jerusalem. And I mean, just really galled the Jews, and they rebelled because he was desecrating the temple. Those kind of things that state cult. Well, the Jews had an exemption from that, so they didn't have to participate in that Caesar worship, the emperor worship. And so, for safety reasons, and to maintain this exemption status that they had to keep up good appearances. They had to be good citizens. They had to exercise their responsibility very carefully and honestly. If the authorities had realized that this new Jesus movement was trying to claim the same exemption, then there would have been repercussions, at least possible repercussions, when they had they didn't have the ethnic rationale, whatever, to back up. They were not Jews, because not all of them were Jews. Some of the Christians were Gentiles. The best, most peaceful course of action that the Jews saw was for these Christians to just become a full-blown Jew. To proselyte, if you're a Gentile, just proselyte into the Jewish faith and be basically a Jewish sect, part of the Jewish nation. If you wanted to claim that exemption from persecution and all, they should go the whole distance and become complete Jews, including male circumcision and following normal Jewish customs like the food laws and the Sabbath observance. Do you remember what the intruders were saying? There's in the first early part of the book, in chapter 1, verse 11 and 12, they were saying Paul got his gospel from the Jerusalem church. He comes back with to counter that accusation that he did not get it from man, or he got it from Jesus himself. They thought he should have known better, since he was likely trained and authorized by the Jerusalem church. They thought he should have known better than try to lead people astray. They saw him as a fickle man-pleaser trying to make conversion easier for the Gentile believers by taking out the distasteful parts like circumcision and the food laws. Chapter 5, verse 11, it sounds like some of them were actually accusing him of preaching circumcision still, which is confusing because that's the very thing that he was not preaching. They just weren't paying attention to what he taught. Perhaps the intruders were worried that the Gentile believers were claiming membership in the Jewish family of Israel, which would really wreak havoc in the Jerusalem church. The Jerusalem congregation was under intense pressure from zealous Judeans who had heard that in Antioch and other places, uncircumcised Gentiles were actually sharing table fellowship with righteous Jews. Very upsetting to these strict Jews. And they believed that this unrighteous behavior would surely dent the favored nation status that they had with the Romans. They would fall out of good graces with Rome because of that. It would also mar the holiness of God's covenant people. They just couldn't see that any way that they should be contaminating themselves by associating with the Gentiles. And it would surely, they felt, delay the coming of the divine judgment and salvation which the Jews longed for and anticipated in their Messiah. When the Messiah came in their minds, they were going to kick Rome out and set up a Jewish kingdom. And so they were, and they really thought that it depended on their being righteous people. And so for some of those people to allow the Gentiles to associate with them, which they saw as a contamination, really did go against their their good judgment. Non-believing Judeans, in other words, Jews that didn't believe in Jesus Christ, like Saul of Tarsus had been. You remember how radical he was in his attacks against Christianity early on. They would do their best to stamp this movement out, even in engaging in violent persecutions and repercussions for the Jerusalem congregation if their leaders tolerated in any way this sharing table with the uncircumcised Gentiles. The best thing, as they saw it, was for these Galilean Gentiles to convert to Judaism, and there would be no hassles of persecution from the Jews or the Romans. All would be peaceful. And Rome was another issue. Some of the Christians were ex-pagans. They had converted to Christianity. And they were in somewhat of an ambiguous situation. They weren't really Jewish. Excuse me. They weren't really Jewish, and they weren't really Roman. So just how did they fit in? And normally the people who didn't worship the gods of Rome, the people there, they were blamed for any disasters that came along. Like this past summer, I was thinking when I was writing some of this to start with, we were on the tail end, as it were, of a drought. Just didn't have any rain, and everything was drying up. And we would have been blamed for that. As Christians, we would have been blamed for that. And perhaps held responsible for it, and that we might have had to pay damages for those who lost crops and things of that nature, lost livestock or whatever. You remember in history that Nero blamed the Christians for the burning of Rome. He started the fires, but he laid it on the Christians, and the people of the empire bought it because they were accustomed to putting the responsibility on the people, the Christians, those who didn't believe in or follow the gods of the nation. So they really felt that if these Christians would just become Jewish proselytes, all the heat would be off. And so that's why these people had come in to these Galatian church, or the Galatian church there, and had been teaching this. In verse 13, Paul says, those who insist that you be circumcised, they don't even keep the law, not the whole law themselves. They just want to be able to show that you are submitting to the Jewish regulations. They want the glory in your flesh. They were trying to impress God with their righteousness and would not submit to God's righteousness. If you recall Romans chapter 10, verse 3, Paul makes that very statement about the Jewish people. They have established their own righteous standards, their own level of righteousness, you could say. They keep the laws to a certain level. But they don't know anything about God's righteousness, which comes to us because we believe and trust Him. All the way back from when Moses wrote Leviticus, they had done this. They trusted in themselves and not in God. It was like a competition with them. Who could keep it the best? Who could keep it the closest? Who could cross all the I's and dot all the T's, we might say today. Paul will say in Romans 9, verse 31 and 2, that they were seeking righteousness by following the law, but they did not attain that righteousness because they did not seek it by faith. The faith in God. Their faith was in their own abilities to keep the rules. And so it generates a question for me. Do we try to impress God with our good deeds? We count, a lot of times we count things like church attendance or Bible knowledge or service to others, all the different things that dimensions of our lives that play into our Christian life. If we do them in a way that we're trying to stack up enough, if we do enough good things, then we'll go to heaven. And sometimes it gets put that way. Or the reverse of it, when someone asks, are you saved? Well, I hope so. Well, I don't do enough. Or all of these questions that show that it's in our minds, our thinking, it's more about us and our performance than it is about God and His performance. And that's where these Jews missed the boat. We have to, all right, let me back up here. If we try to impress Him with our good deeds, do we think that we're fairly good at doing the right things? And that is a real dead-end street. We must trust His mercy. He is graciously willing to work through us to help us to become His people. In verse 14, Paul says, God forbid that I should glory in anything but what Jesus Christ has done on the cross. And that should be our feelings too. It is through Him that the world has been put to death, as far as I'm concerned, Paul says. And it's through Him that I have been killed, as far as my world is concerned. In other words, He doesn't do anything because of the world's expectations. In verse 15, it says, for in Christ all that matters is a new creation. And I wonder sometimes if we really believe that. We can't stay the same in our lives. If you think, well, this is just the way I am and I can't change. You need to get to know Jesus Christ. You need to learn what He thinks. You need to know what He teaches. You need to really hear those things. How He prays. And how He reacts. And how He cares for folks. He really does different than what we normally do. He reacts differently. Getting acquainted with Him will change you. The way you think, the way you react, and the way you care for folks. As we follow Him, observing His Spirit, we are changed into His likeness, Paul says in 2 Corinthians 3, verse 18. It's one little bit at a time. We're changed into the very image of Christ. Listen to these words a little further down in that 2 Corinthians chapter. Actually, it's in chapter 4, verse 6 and 7. For it is God who commanded light to shine out of darkness, who has shown in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. But we have this treasure, this light or this knowledge. We have this treasure in earthen vessels, our physical bodies, that the excellence of the power may be of God and not of us. So we have this power in our bodies, but it's very obvious that this power is not sourced in us. It does not come from us. It is coming from God Himself. So there is hope for you to change. It won't be you doing it all, but you can change. It's who you know, and it's who you hang out with that makes it possible. So, today, this little study is, Galatians is a short book, but it's a good book. It's got lots of deep thoughts in it. And it's good to go through it and spend time meditating on what Paul says there. If you want to make a change in your life, it's still possible, even at an old age or a young age. Doesn't matter. So, just give you this opportunity to address that, and make those changes if you want. To begin, at least, to make a commitment or renew the commitment. If you have things that you need prayers for, if you will come, we stand and we sing this song. We'll be glad to help you any way we can. Please come.